In this series, we'll be going over all of the cards banned in the commons only format, Pauper, and discussing why they're banned if they can be unbanned today. This video will be going through some of Pauper's earliest bans back when it was an online exclusive format, as well as the bans that came most quickly after a card's printing to look at some cards that were generally just too strong for Pauper in the first place. The first card we'll be covering is Cranial Plating, an equipment artifact that costs 2 generic mana and had an equip cost of 1 generic mana. The equipped creature gains +1 power for each artifact you control, and may pay 2 black mana to attach Cranial Plating to another creature you control at instant speed. This card was banned in December of 2008. So why was Cranial Plating banned? The card made aggressive artifact decks too powerful. Aggressive artifact decks were able to leverage Cranial Plating's attack boost to threaten massive damage if the opponent wasn't careful. If your opponent left even one creature unblocked, you could pay the mana to attach Cranial Plating to that creature and steal a chunk of damage. There was also the added benefit of having a lot of power coming from a non-creature permanent. Not only did this mean that your creature removal would usually not be able to hit Cranial Plating, but even if your creature was removed, you could just move the equipment to a new one and keep up the pressure. The only real cost was needing a high density of artifacts on board. This was especially easy considering that the Mirrodin artifact lands allowed you to cast more artifacts while also counting as one themselves. And considering those lands were all at common even at the time of Pauper's introduction, this synergy would have been fully available in the format without bans. Cranial Plating saw success during its time in Standard, as well as consistent results in non-rotating formats like Modern. While Cranial Plating itself was never banned in any of these formats, it was one of the key cards for the deck and one of its strongest. As such, Wizards was concerned with allowing the card to run rampant in the new format and pre-banned it out of precaution. Aggressive artifact decks like Affinity have proven powerful without Cranial Plating, to a point where there are more cards on the ban list specifically because of these aggressive artifact decks. Could Cranial Plating be unbanned? No. As we just said, there are quite a few cards banned specifically because of Affinity's power level in Pauper, and Cranial Plating is far and away the strongest. At the time of recording, Affinity is one of the better decks in the format, and would be even more explosive and resilient with access to cards like Cranial Plating. Affinity even has access to cards like Gingerbrute, which did not exist when Cranial Plating was banned. Gingerbrute can only be blocked by creatures with haste if you pay 1 generic mana, meaning that with enough artifacts you'd be able to force through lethal with Cranial Plating relatively easily. And that's without even considering the introduction of bridges, indestructible artifact lands that tap for 2 colors and allow Affinity to build easily into any color combination, and increase options more than ever. Cranial Plating was too powerful back when the deck only had the monocolor artifact lands to work off of. Now there are enough artifact lands in the format that many Affinity builds run 2 or less non-artifact lands. Cranial Plating even has a direct comparison in All That Glitters, an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1 power toughness for each artifact and enchantment you control. This effect offers more stats in exchange for not being able to move it to other creatures. And despite the lack of flexibility, All That Glitters is a powerful card that some builds of Affinity have retooled to play around. How could Cranial Plating be fixed to be unbanned? Its most glaringly overtuned feature is its ability to attach itself at instant speed. This makes it impossible for an opponent to effectively block, since Cranial Plating can just be moved to wherever it's most problematic. If you could only equip this card with its inherent sorcery speed equipment cost, the card would still be potent, but perhaps not quite as ban-worthy. The fact that All That Glitters isn't ban-worthy as an aura proves that there is at least a fair version of this sort of effect that can exist. The question just is, how much power does Cranial Plating have to sacrifice? And even then, if both were legal together, Affinity might overtake the format even with Cranial Plating hypothetically getting nerfed. To more dramatically rein in the card, one could also make it only track either creature or non-creature artifacts instead of both, limiting the output of Cranial Plating altogether. Although, if you could still freely equip it at instant speed, it would likely still be quite playable. The next card to have this level of impact on Pauper was Frantic Search. This instant costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana, and draws 2 cards and discards 2 cards. Then you untap up to 3 lands. Due to the nature of MTG Go at the time of Pauper's introduction, many older sets had not yet been released into Arena. One such set was Urza's Legacy, which was added to the client in 2010, then swiftly banned in June of 2011. Why was Frantic Search banned? It pays for itself by untapping the lands used to cast it. If any of your lands tap for 2 or more mana, you can even go positive on mana from casting Frantic Search. This made the card generically quite powerful in a wide variety of blue decks, but most particularly Frantic Search supercharged Storm decks in particular. Storm is a mechanic that copies itself for each spell cast before this turn, regardless of who cast it. As such, decks have been built to simply cast as many spells as possible in a single turn to get a game-winning number of Storm copies on the stack. This mechanic is so powerful that multiple formats have had Storm as one of their most prominent decks. and with several commons with the Storm keyword, Pauper was no exception. Initially, Wizards did not want to outright ban the deck out of playability, instead opting to ban Frantic Search given how powerful an enabler it was for the deck. Storm decks often played spells known as rituals, which generate more mana than they cost, which is usually balanced by the fact that the mana is temporary. Most decks would rather develop their boards than dedicate too many slots to rituals. However, Storm decks use rituals to both cast more spells to raise the storm count, but also keep generating mana to cast more spells. These rituals made Frantic Search even more powerful, since that ritual mana could be used to help cast Frantic Search, which could in turn untap lands that provide more relevant colors. Despite costing blue, Frantic Search was ironically a consistent way for Storm decks to cheat up more access to blue mana in hands without access to Manamorphous. The banning of Frantic Search did little to dampen the power of Storm decks in the format, although that speaks more to the power of Storm than anything. Could Frantic Search be unbanned? No. Frantic Search, if unbanned, would slot right into several decks into the format. Not only would spell-centric combo decks like Storm want the card, even slower decks like Dimir Terror will be likely able to find enough value from the card selection and graveyard fuel it provides. Mana efficiency is important in Pauper, given the general weakness of commons compared to a lot of other rarities. A card that is essentially free and sets up decks further is just too good for the format. It's hard to imagine blue decks that would not want to run Frantic Search for one reason or another. It just offers too much tempo, allowing you to sculpt your hand and graveyard on turn 3 while still developing a threat or just developing resources further. Even when played completely fair with no combo or storm potential, the card would still put you ahead and only really cost you if it's countered. How could Frantic Search be fixed to be unbanned? Frantic Search could be unbanned if it were not inherently mana neutral. If it only untapped 1 or 2 lands, then you would have to use an additional card or land that specifically taps for more than 1 mana to abuse it. As it currently exists, there's just too many ways to break the card, and there's no real cost to playing it beyond already being at 3 mana. The only other reasonable option would be to raise its mana value to the point of unplayability, although that is somewhat against the spirit of fixing a card. Frantic Search is just a relic of a highly experimental time and magic card design, and the sort of design that has not really been revisited much. These days, spells often refund themselves through treasures, which have broken Pauper in their own way, and the even more powerful method of untapping is generally left off the table, barring splashy mythic rares. Storm decks continue to be a menace to the format despite the loss of Frantic Search. These decks would need to be addressed on further ban lists, and again, basically any time Wizards makes the mistake of printing another playable common with the keyword. The first was Grape Shot, which costs 1 generic and 1 red mana for a sorcery that deals 1 damage to any target, and of course had the ability Storm. It was banned alongside Empty the Warrens, another Storm spell which costs 3 generic and 1 red mana and creates 2 goblin creature tokens with 1 power and toughness. Both spells were banned in February 2013 and marked the beginning of a hot streak of Storm bans for the format. They were swiftly followed by Temporal Fissure, which costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana and can return target permanent to its owner's hand. After this, Storm went quiet for a while as all of the best commons with keywords were banned, up until Modern Horizons 2 reintroduced Storm as a draft archetype and by extension printed new Storm commons. Chatterstorm costs 1 generic and 1 green mana to create a squirrel token with 1 power and toughness. It was banned in September 2021, and it only took a few months longer for the other notable Modern Horizons 2 Storm spell, Galvanic Relay, to also get hit. Galvanic Relay also costs 2 generic and 1 red mana, has Storm, and allows you to exile the top card of your library and play it during your next turn. It was banned in March of 2022, and to this day is the most recent Storm spell on the list. Why were the Storm spells banned? Grape Shot's low mana value alongside its direct damage made it an ideal win condition in Storm decks in various formats, especially in 2013. While casting 20 spells in 1 turn was a tall order for most decks, it was not impossible for a properly built Storm deck. And even if you couldn't kill your opponent outright with Grape Shot, you'd drop them so low that the follow-up turn would need very little further cards to pull out a win. Since each copy could have a new target, you'd also be able to use Grape Shot to clear out threatening boards that would kill you before you get enough damage to kill your opponent. While Empty the Warrens is a less overt way of winning the game than Grape Shot, since you still need to attack with these goblin tokens to win, this is often a more resilient way for a Storm player to navigate their win. Empty the Warrens rewards Storming by producing a wall of goblins to both chump block with to set up for future Storm turns, or just go on the aggressive. Considering Pauper generally lacks when it comes to mass removal, it also meant that answering the goblin tokens usually came through the slow process of trading out in combat. Even if an opponent had blockers, you generally could make enough tokens that they simply couldn't block enough damage over a few turns of attacks. These two spells together made Storm far and away the best deck in the format, even without Frantic Search. and mirror matches often just came down to who went for the win first with the most options in hand. Once they were gone, Temporal Fissure was left legal to try and allow Storm to exist in some capacity, which quickly proved to be a mistake. Temporal Fissure cost more than the previous spells and lacked any direct way of ending the game since it only returned target permanent to its owner's hand. However, Pauper, especially at this time, was known for its ability to cheat on mana. This meant for many decks, not just dedicated Storm decks, Temporal Fissure was a one-sided upheaval, able to bounce not only all of your opponent's threats, but also every land they currently controlled as well. This massive tempo swing would set your opponent back several turns, to a point where the Temporal Fissure player would almost certainly run away with the game from there. The Modern Horizons 2 Storm cards were designed with years of hindsight, and were designed with Pauper in mind on some level. While Chatterstorm produced half the tokens of Empty the Warrens, costing half the mana as well helped make up the difference and, if anything, made it stronger than Empty the Warrens, given it requires less investment of mana. The card was especially lethal when paired alongside the board-wide haste enabler First Day of Class, which had been printed between Storm's periods of playability, allowing the army of tokens to swing for lethal damage the turn they were created. Galvanic Relay is by far the weakest of the bunch. It essentially was a Storm card that existed only to set you up for the follow-up turn. Even then, it was so good in red-black Storm decks using Experimental Synthesizer that it too wound up being banned. You'd often just go for a medium-sized Storm turn with Galvanic Relay to draw into enough cards that, on the next turn, you just kill them outright through other means, or just set up a massive value turn that your opponent could never match. Could the Storm spells be unbanned? No. To this day, it's arguable that Grape Shot is still the strongest common Storm spell ever printed, to a point where unbanning it is unlikely. There are far more enablers for the strategy in the format now, and the reintroduction of Grape Shot into the format would likely just catapult the deck right back up to top tier contention. Some could say that Grape Shot is the least likely card to be unbanned in the format, given how many clearer, weaker Storm cards have been banned after it. As for Empty the Warrens, it is arguably easier to unban in part thanks to its high mana value, straining the already tight mana production of Storm decks. And unlike Grape Shot, the format does have some means of reasonably answering the tokens produced by Empty the Warrens. That said, there are only so many answers, and black is really the only color with access to them, so it's hard to say unbanning Empty the Warrens is all that likely. Especially since these big mana decks don't tend to mine the mana value of 4 when it's the last spell they cast. And while big mana decks, especially Storm, are not as strong as they used to be, there's still more than enough mana generation and ability to Storm in the format that Temporal Fissure is still arguably too powerful to be unbanned, since it essentially erases your opponent's entire board process to a point where it's near impossible to catch up. Capsize is a card known for its ability to slowly take over a game by bouncing permanents one by one, and Temporal Fissure essentially offers it all in one go if you can muster a decent Storm turn. Chatterstorm essentially being half an Empty the Warrens ironically makes it harder to unban, given it's even more explosive of a Storm spell and easier to capitalize on with middling combo turns. While it has the same weakness that Empty the Warrens does, in that it dies to Pestilence, it similarly only has to worry about such a hard counter from black. Galvanic Relay is the most recent Storm ban and arguably the one that most easily can come off the list, given the sheer impact every other banned Storm spell has. But that said, its status as a recent ban means that the card was already proven to be too good for the Pauper meta. If anything, Galvanic Relay being so comparatively weak should show how impossible it is to unban any of these other spells. How could the Storm spells be fixed? Realistically, there is no way to fix the spells from the format without removing their Storm ability, and thus their entire reason for existing altogether. Storm is such a broken mechanic that Wizards name their internal scale for determining how broken a mechanic is after it. While there are some Storm spells that are still legal in Pauper and even playable, wind up in decks like Cyclade Storm that are weak to Graveyard Hate or other forms of interaction. Pauper Storm decks are just too easily supported by the density of common rarity rituals and draw power to not dominate to a point where the only way to fix these cards would be to remove Storm altogether. Even if you doubled the mana values of some of these spells, it's likely they would still try to play the deck and find success with it. Mind's Desire is a Storm spell with a mana value of 6 that has seen play in multiple formats throughout the years, so simply making these spells cost more likely would not be enough. Pauper's power level is strained too much by conventional Storm decks for any decent effective Storm spells to ever be legal. While other bans would come in the meantime, the next new problem card to the format would come with the release of the Takir block in 2014. Treasure Cruise is a sorcery that costs 7 generic mana and 1 blue mana and draws 3 cards. The keyword ability Delve allows you to exile cards from your graveyard while casting the spell, with each card exiled this way paying for 1 generic mana of the spell's cost. This means, if you exiled 7 cards from your graveyard, Treasure Cruise would still just cost 1 blue mana. The card was banned less than a year after its printing in March of 2015. Why was Treasure Cruise banned? Delving away enough cards essentially turned the spell into Ancestral Recall, one of the most powerful Magic cards ever printed. While 7 cards is certainly a lot, the flexibility of Delve meant that if you needed to cast the spell earlier for a bit more mana, you could do so. Delve in general was an extremely powerful ability, but Treasure Cruise in particular proved to be one of the most overpowered designs from the block. To this day, the card is banned in both Modern and Legacy, and even Vintage has it restricted to just 1 copy per deck. It's no surprise then that it took Pauper less than a full year after its printing to also ban Treasure Cruise. There are some arguments that Treasure Cruise is more fair in Pauper than in other formats. Eternal formats have access to fetch lands, which help fill the graveyard much faster, as well as generally more powerful self-mill strategies. However, even at the time of printing, Pauper had many ways of filling the graveyard to facilitate getting a Treasure Cruise quicker. It doesn't help that Pauper is a slowed format that can generally afford to wait a bit longer to cast Treasure Cruise and still get good value from it. Treasure Cruise was just an overwhelming card upon release, and to this day is generally seen as an egregious design mistake, let alone ban-worthy in Pauper. Blue has historically been one of the strongest colors in Pauper since its inception, and Treasure Cruise made it almost the de facto best color of the format during the time of its legality. Could Treasure Cruise ever get unbanned? No. As a comparison, Gurmag Angular is one of the premier creatures in the format thanks to having the Delve keyword. This is the only value that Gurmag Angular offers beyond having decent stats, and that alone is enough for it to be arguably the best black creature in the format. Slower decks fill up the graveyard with land cycling cards and interaction, and then dropping Angular for little to no cost. Treasure Cruise would have all of the same ease of casting, yet instead of being a decent aggressive body, it would instead refill your hand. Treasure Cruise is just generally too powerful for most formats given how its design accidentally made it the second coming of a member of the Power 9. While it is nowhere near as powerful as Ancestral Recall, it remains one of the most powerful draw spells ever printed, and almost certainly too powerful for Pauper with how it has evolved in recent years. While Pauper does not have fetch lands, it has in the years since gained access to land cycling cards, which serve a similar purpose to fetch lands in both fixing and filling the graveyard with fodder cards. It's easier than ever to fill your graveyard in Pauper, to a point where blue-black decks would run Gurmag Angular and Treasure Cruise together without much trouble. How could Treasure Cruise be fixed? Treasure Cruise is another card where it's hard to fix without outright ruining it. The nature of Delve makes it so that unless its mana costs were well over double digits, it would still likely be playable. As such, the only real other options are to make it draw less cards. If it were a Divination instead of an Ancestral Recall, then it might have been more reasonable. But even that might be too pushed for the likes of the Pauper format. Making it draw just 1 card would be too far, however, since Pauper already has access to Ponder and much other more powerful cantrips. The only other realistic way of doing so would be to limit how much of its mana cost you're able to pay by delving by giving it more blue pips. If Treasure Cruise cost 5 generic and 3 blue mana, it would be perhaps its most fair iteration, but also far less playable than what was actually printed. 6 generic and 2 blue mana would likely still be too good and push the card to a point of being banned in multiple formats still, especially Pauper. Treasure Cruise exists in a strange spot where it's broken as it currently exists, but most attempts at fixing it would either do nothing or outright ruin the card. In this series, we'll be going over all the cards banned in the commons only format, Pauper, and discussing why they're banned and if they could be unbanned today. This video will go over the cards that were banned when Pauper became an official sanctioned format, as well as more cards that were banned within a year of their introduction to the format. Pauper became sanctioned in 2019, and with it retooled how legality worked in the format to a degree. Up until then, Pauper was only recognized as a format in MTGO, with Paper Pauper existing as a casual, unsanctioned format. As such, the card legality in Pauper was determined by what cards were printed as a common in MTGO. While this mostly mirrored the paper card pool's commons, there were some notable exceptions. With the introduction of Pauper as a sanctioned format, they opted to make any common eligible for Pauper legality, regardless of where it was printed as common. With this, however, Wizards banned 3 cards that had not been legal online, but were commons in old paper printings. The first of these cards was Sinkhole, a sorcerer that costs 2 black mana and destroys target land, and was banned in June of 2019. So why was Sinkhole banned? Land destruction is an effect that Magic tends to shy away from in modern card design, with most land destruction in the modern day specifically punishing non-basics or having high mana values. This alone would have made Wizards hesitant to introduce Sinkhole to the format, but what really pushed Sinkhole over the edge was that Pauper already had a playable mono-black land destruction deck. Sinkhole's mana value of 2 beat every other land destruction spell in the format in terms of efficiency. Decks already ran cards like Rancid Earth at 4 copies in decks. The addition of Sinkhole would allow these decks to shave down their mana curves and more consistently overwhelm your opponent in the early game. Mono black land destruction decks are somewhat lacking in playable 2-drops, relying on the generically good black draw spells to fill spaces in the decks. Even with these, the deck often lacks impactful turn 2 plays, with Lurking Informant or similar creatures often filling spots. The addition of Sinkhole would allow these decks to focus on their primary game plan lower on the curve and shave the higher mana value land destruction spells altogether. Wizards worried about pushing the power level of an already somewhat infamous archetype into the format and opted to pre-ban Sinkhole before it could enter sanctioned Pauper. Wizards does not ban cards exclusively for power level concerns, and has in the past banned cards that encourage play patterns deemed as unhealthy for the meta or especially unfun to play against. While land destruction has its fans, a majority of the player base and designers alike do not enjoy the play pattern or find them healthy for good magic. As such, it's not surprising to see why they banned the card, especially since its only reprint in recent times had printed the card as a rare. Sinkhole was only ever printed as a common back in the days of Alpha before bouncing for limited, let alone Pauper, was even a consideration. Beyond its unfun nature in the format, it would only be legal via technicality and did not fit with the general spirit of common cards by modern standards. Could Sinkhole be unbanned? No. While giving these decks Sinkhole might not break the game, it would not do any good for the health of the format, and as such, Sinkhole is likely to stay in the ban list. It would only help a deck that already is fine without it and make for more games where one player doesn't get to play Magic. Given that Wizards of the Coast has an aversion to non-conditional land destruction in general, it's hard to believe they'd ever want to unban Sinkhole, even if they felt like it was perfectly balanced for the format. In fact, Sinkhole is mana efficient enough that decks not even built around land destruction might pick up the card, at least for sideboards. The biggest point against Sinkhole is that Affinity runs a high number of indestructible lands, but one bad matchup in the format full of decks trying to make the most out of their mana is not enough to say the card is reasonable. As of now, land destruction sits on the fringes of the format, which is arguably where Wizards wants it, if they want it in the format at all. The addition of Sinkhole would only push a playstyle Wizards wants to avoid to further prominence, especially with the hype of an unbanning, and thus it will likely remain on the ban list forever. How could Sinkhole be fixed to be unbanned? The most simple way of fixing Sinkhole would be to simply increase its mana value by 1, putting it on the same rate with Stone Rain, which is the mana value Wizards feels comfortable printing targeted land destruction at without drawbacks. This would notably make the card one of the weaker options for mono black land destruction, since Icequake and other 3-mana land destruction spells often even have upsides. Its mana value really is the only thing overtly pushing Sinkhole into the category of being too good. If it costs any more than 2, Sinkhole would likely have never been looked at for a ban during the unification. While that may seem like an overly minor thing to hinge an entire ban on, land destruction is innately more impactful the sooner you can cast it. The longer you wait to cast land destruction spells, the more likely your opponent will have drawn lands to replace it. Sinkhole can hit early and set your opponent back before they've even cast a spell, and allows you to run away with the game from there. At 3 mana, it's just enough in the list of land destruction spells that even just a turn later feels so much worse to cast. Your opponent has had a whole extra turn to potentially develop a threat, not to mention if they spend their turns developing their mana and offset your land destruction outright. While a small change at the surface, adding 1 generic mana to the cost of Sinkhole really would make all the difference. The second card banned upon the unification of Pauper was Hymn to Torok. This sorcery costs 2 black mana, it makes target player discard 2 cards at random, and was banned in June of 2019. Why was Hymn to Torok banned? Most formats have access to targeted discard spells which allow you to rip away the most dangerous cards from your opponent. These discard spells are often printed at uncommon or higher, leaving black Pauper decks to mostly rely on spells that your opponent choose what card they discard. Hymn to Torok exists in a middle ground where you might discard nothing of impact, or you might completely ruin your opponent's hand. Even the strongest discard spells like Thoughtseize tend to limit you from taking lands. Meanwhile, Hymn to Torok, with a bit of luck, can sometimes discard both of the lands into your opponent's hand, and leave them completely unable to play. Wrench Mind is already legal in Pauper, and is a similar 2-for-1 discard most of the time at the same mana value. It does see some play in mono black decks of the format, yet the choices it gives your opponent holds it back from being half as oppressive as Hymn to Torok would be. Not only does your opponent get to decide what 2 cards to discard to Wrench Mind, if they have an artifact to discard, they don't even have to discard a second card. In comparison, Hymn to Torok will rip apart your opponent's hand regardless of what either player would want. Blue decks will be forced to burn their counter magic on Hymn to Torok out of fear of losing 2 more powerful spells, while against the format's more typical discard options, they'd usually be free to discard the least important card in their hand. Most discard spells with low mana values go neutral in card advantage, yet Hymn to Torok will put your opponent behind on cards every time it resolves, even if it doesn't necessarily hit the most important cards in the hand. And when it does snipe their best cards, sometimes it wins you the game on the spot. Hymn to Tourach is especially backbreaking against an opponent who has mulliganed down to less cards in their hand, with a 5 or less card starting essentially being a death sentence if your opponent has Hymn to Tourach in hand. Could Hymn to Tourach be unbanned? No. It's another case where the card is not the most broken card on the ban list and might not outright warp the meta. However, the random nature of the discard adds a level of unwelcome variance and outright non-games that Wizards tends to frown upon. It's hard to argue that the ability to use Dark Ritual to cast Hymn to Tourach on the first turn alongside 1-mana discard spells like Raven's Crime is something that would be healthy for the format. As such, it was a reasonable ban at the time of its introduction to the format, and remains that way to this day. Black decks already have the ability to interact without paying mana thanks to spells like Snuff Out. Black control decks do not need the added disruption that Hymn to Tourach spreads throughout the game to be viable, and will just likely muscle out other decks if the card were ever unbanned. In general, random discard is avoided these days for the most part, especially at mana values this low. While land destruction exists on the fringes of playability, but not necessarily meta, discard has always been a part of Mono Black Control's toolkit in Pauper. As such, Hymn to Tourach would be more than an issue of simply being a card that supports unhealthy play patterns and designs. It would be a mana-efficient one that was likely to see actual competitive play. How could Hymn to Tourach be fixed? While the most straightforward solution would be to make you discard your opponent's choice instead of random, one could argue allowing Pauper both Wretched Mind and even this nerfed 2-mana Hymn to Tourach might be too powerful. Raising its mana value would keep the unique nature of discarding 2 cards at random, but make it more reasonable. A mana value of 4 would prevent someone from Dark Ritualing it on turn 1, but it might also prevent the card from ever seeing play. The best option then would likely be meet in the middle, with the first discard being random and the second being of your opponent's choice. This would still make it better than Wrench Mine, maintaining some of its original mechanical identity, and reduce the blow-up potential of the card. It's by no means perfect, and some may argue it may still need a mana value increase to be a healthy power level card for Pauper even with this, but it is certainly more reasonable than the card as it currently exists. The final of the 3 cards banned upon unification was High Tide. This instant costs 1 blue mana and makes it so until the end of turn. Whenever a player taps an island for mana, that player adds an additional blue mana. It was banned in June of 2019. So why was High Tide banned? Well, High Tide has a lot of room for combo potential, with legacy decks using Candelabra of Tuanos to one-tap lands and generate enough mana to start a proper combo turn. Pauper is no stranger to combo decks built off of generating a lot of mana, but there was concern that High Tide provided too much too easily. While many of High Tide's best combo pieces are not legal, Ghostly Flicker was already a staple of the format given the value and combo potential it had. High Tide decks in particular would be able to not only untap their islands to generate more mana, but could also flicker an Archaeomancer to put High Tide back in hand and cast it again. Since High Tide's stacked, flickering in this way would allow your islands to go positive when casting spells far easier and carry you through the combo turn. Hypothetical Pauper High Tide lists brewed for paper Pauper before unification often won off of the back of Sage Road Denizen. This 3-mana Vidalcan Wizard would mill your opponent for 2 cards whenever a blue creature entered the battlefield. With enough mana from High Tide, it would be fairly trivial to loop your flicker spells and creatures that added them back to hand, and eventually mill your opponent out. While Pauper does not have access to many tutors, it does notably have Merchant Scroll. Merchant Scroll searches instants and adds it to hand, meaning that High Tide decks would have virtually had 8 copies of the card to work with, as well as ways to search up Ghostly Flicker. Now, could High Tide be unbanned? This one is a maybe. Of the cards banned with the format sanctioning, High Tide is one that is most easily argued for an unbanning. While you could set up impressive combo turns that win the game on the spot, in practice, these High Tide combos are slow or clunky. They needed time or luck to set up or draw into the proper pieces. It doesn't help that High Tide is generally a flimsy strategy, with a deck that doesn't even really do much usually if not allowed to resolve its namesake card. This is Pauper, however, so a deck being somewhat slow isn't necessarily a death sentence. With proper building to counteract the aggro of the format, High Tide would likely be playable, but there are strong control decks in the format with access to powerful answers. It might even be outpaced by more aggressive tuned combo decks. That said, given the format's history with decks that cheat on mana to combo off on, or blaze ahead of your opponent, it's understandable why they chose not to allow High Tide into the format, and have kept it banned to this day. The rest of the cards added to the format after unification either slotted into decks or faded into the background, with no bans coming in the immediate months after Pauper's rise to being sanctioned. As for High Tide itself, it has remained on the ban list since, with some insistent that its addition to the format would introduce an interesting new deck to the meta. Others are less convinced, especially given that High Tide decks are an archetype robust enough for Legacy when given enough appropriate cards to build around. So how could High Tide be fixed? Given its borderline status in terms of balance, it wouldn't take too much to rein in High Tide. For one, simply making it a sorcery would turn off the ability to search it with a card like Mystical Teachings, as well as limit the timings in which someone could go for a big High Tide play. A more drastic measure to balance the card would be giving it a once per turn restriction, making it so you cannot make your islands tap for anything more than 1 additional blue mana. This would greatly dampen the card's combo potential, limiting you to only the most efficient ways to take advantage of High Tide, such as with Candlebar of Taros, which is not Pauper legal. This weaker version may even still see some play as a more conventional mana acceleration tool and not as a combo piece, although it's hard to say for certain if being a glorified ritual only would be worth it. Some can and will argue that High Tide could re-enter the format as is with little to no changes and be perfectly fine, especially since the deck would often fold to a well-timed duress anyway. Considering that it never saw sanctioned play in Pauper, we may never fully know if it would be healthy for the format as it currently exists. It wouldn't be long after unification until Pauper saw its next shakeup with the rise of Modern Horizons. A few months after Pauper became official, the format was introduced to Arkham's Astrolabe. It costs 1 generic snow mana, which can be paid with 1 mana from any permanent with the snow type, and is a snow artifact itself. When Arkham's Astrolabe enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 generic mana and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. The artifact was banned in October of 2019. Now, why was Arkham's Astrolabe banned? This card became infamous quickly in multiple formats for how much it trivialized mana bases. Its mana efficiency made it a cantrip that replaced itself, and from there could filter your mana into any color. Snow basically provided mana flexibility that usually only came from rare dual lands. This advantage was notable in Modern and Legacy, and thus was even more polarizing in a format like Pauper, which had been up to that point defined by an inability for greedy mana bases to get ahead. Multicolored decks needed to rely on slower tap lands usually, whereas Astrolabe allowed you to play with basics and still cast spells in upwards of 3 or 4 colors. Scred became one of the premier removal spells in the format now that snow permanents were so rewarding to run. The outcry for a banning for the card was so immense that when it wasn't included in the regularly scheduled ban list update for all formats, Wizards banned it in an unplanned second ban announcement 2 weeks later. So, could Arkham's Astrolabe be unbanned? The answer to that question is probably no. Arkham's Astrolabe offers a level of consistency the format just does not want or need. Multicolor decks are not struggling in the format and have plenty of tools that make them reasonable without pushing half as far as Astrolabe does. Ash Barrens and other land cycling cards provide quality options for multicolor decks, but still limit them to playing slower as a result. In comparison, Arkham's Astrolabe actively rewards the player for wanting to play it by replacing itself and makes for quicker, more flexible multicolor mana bases on top of that. One of the key weaknesses of playing a deck that's 3 or more colors is supposed to be less consistency and ability to cast your spells. Something Arkham's Astrolabe lets you circumvent in a way that uses basic lands enough that it lets these greedy mana bases dodge conventional anti-non-basic hate cards. Instead of helping cover for a weakness, Arkham's Astrolabe outright got rid of it. It's currently banned in Legacy and Modern for similar reasons, and thus it's unlikely to ever come off the list in the much lower power format of Pauper. It not only built a whole archetype around itself, it being a 1-mana artifact that drew a card on entering the battlefield also makes it a viable option for Coldrith Rebirth style decks as well as various other artifact-based strategies like the Affinity. How could Arkham's Astrolabe be fixed to be unbanned? The most practical way of fixing Arkham's Astrolabe would be at a minimum to double its mana value. At just 1 mana, Arkham's Astrolabe fixes your mana as early as turn 2 in most games. You were free to flex into whatever 2-drop you wanted to cast and would generally be able to play it no matter what colors you needed access to. And from there, you'd be on solid footing throughout the rest of the game. By removing the ability to cast Astrolabe so early, you'd curb just how easily snow decks accessed all their colors. Another option would be to make it so that the mana Arkham's Astrolabe produces can only be used to cast snow spells or for the abilities of snow permanents. This would allow the card to remain powerful, but now only function to benefit dedicated snow decks. As the card currently exists, it just made decks pivot their mana base's interaction towards a snow focus, since snow mana was so easily accessible instead of actually building a snow deck. The next card to warp Pauper to a game-breaking degree upon arrival, and the last one we'll talk about today, was the Throne of Eldrain's Mystic Sanctuary. This land taps for 1 blue mana and enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more islands. When Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. This card was banned from Pauper in July of 2020. Now, why was Mystic Sanctuary banned? Well, worse than an island if used as one of your first land drops, in the mid to late game, Mystic Sanctuary offers value at worst and the potential to overtake a game at best. A common play pattern for Mystic Sanctuary was to use it to set up loops where you'd always be able to redraw into the same counterspell, and thus always have an answer for whatever your opponent happened to top deck. The most common way of doing this would be via using Deprive, a 2-mana counterspell with additional cost of bouncing a land you control back to hand. This downside is actually an upside with Mystic Sanctuary, allowing you to reuse enter the battlefield triggers and put Deprive back on top. Other than Deprive, Tragic Lesson provided a way to both draw the card stacked on top and bounce the Mystic Sanctuary back to hand at once. Modern banned Mystic Sanctuary for similar reasons, and Pauper's access to extremely powerful common spells made it arguably just as powerful there as it was in Modern. As such, the card was banned less than a year later. Now, could Mystic Sanctuary be unbanned? The answer to this question is probably no. Any deck that ran blue could reasonably find reason to slot in 2 copies of Mystic Sanctuary and use them to extend the grind game far further than it would have gone otherwise. Mystic Sanctuary is a card that would only limit the ability for more powerful common instants and sorceries to be printed into the format. Unbanning it would just push Dimir Terror decks far too ahead of the pack, as well as bolstering just about every other blue strategy in the process. Looping Mystic Sanctuary is too much of a problem to realistically not address, and it is more practical to leave Mystic Sanctuary banned than ban Deprive and every other card that can loop the land. How could Mystic Sanctuary be fixed to be unbanned? Mystic Sanctuary has the complexity and power of a rare squeezed into a common. To rectify that, it would be better if Mystic Sanctuary shuffled the instant to sorcery back into your deck instead of putting it on top. This would still likely be a decently playable card, especially with Merchant Scroll in the format to help find the card that got shuffled back in. The card would be nowhere near as ubiquitous and not truly loopable, but those are all changes that would likely bring the card down to the general power level of Pauper's card pool. Other than that, there aren't many other changes that could help make it reasonable that don't strip the card of its identity. We have Invigorate. This instant costs 2 generic and 1 green mana. If you control a forest, you may have an opponent gain 3 life instead of paying Invigorate's mana cost. Invigorate gives target creature plus 4 power and toughness until end of turn. It was banned from Pauper in February of 2013. Now, why was Invigorate banned? This card only saw play in decks built around the mechanic Infect. Creatures with Infect deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters and to players in the form of poison counters. While this means your opponent doesn't take direct damage, if any player has 10 poison counters, they immediately lose the game. Infect inherently rewards players playing pump spells due to the deck focusing on dealing 10 damage as fast as possible. But what pushed Invigorate over the top for the strategy is the spell is completely free in Infect. Gaining the opponent 3 life would usually dampen the impact of dealing 4 extra damage with a creature outside of using it as a combat trick. However, considering Infect does not care about your opponent's life total at all, Invigorate could gain your opponent 10 life and still have seen just as much play. Coupled with Glistener Elf as a 1-drop Infect creature, Invigorate allowed these decks to pressure for lethal swings on turn 2 or 3 with optimal hands. One of the primary weaknesses of an all-in aggro deck is the inability to develop your mana. Infect will generally try and run the most efficient spells possible to maximize the number of early lethal hands. Invigorate pushes any 1-power creature to 5, which is half the poison counters needed to kill someone. And since Invigorate doesn't cost any mana, you're free to cast more pump spells, some of which will also not cost mana, like Mutagenic Growth. Infect was one of the better decks in the format at the time of Invigorate's banning, although it notably was not the best deck. Storm was still running rampant at the time, a deck discussed in a previous episode of the series. In fact, Invigorate was banned alongside the first Storm bans out of concerns that Infect would be far too dominant in the post-Storm format now that it was no longer checked by Grapeshot, and just generally outclassed by the combo deck. Could Invigorate be unbanned? Yes. After the banning of Invigorate, Infect instantly fell off from competitive deck to a rogue option. While Infect still exists and sees play to this day, it is by no means the threat it used to be. Pauper has become a generally more efficient format, dominated by aggro decks that leverage cards like Experimental Synthesizer to make up on card advantage instead of explosive turns. Not only does Infect's playstyle fit with the current expectations of Pauper with fast stacks threatening early, high damage attacks, it's arguably far less resilient than these currently legal options. Pauper lacks any real evasive Infect attackers beyond Blighted Agent, which costs 2 mana and requires you to run a second color, both factors that slow the deck down considerably in practice. As such, the Infect player generally needs to not only assemble 10 or more damage, they need to give the creature some means of not being blocked, or dealing damage despite being blocked. While cards like Rancor give a creature trample, meaning any excess damage dealt after killing a creature in combat is dealt to your opponent, they force Infect to draw more specific cards. Invigorate does not help this weakness, instead aiding on mana efficiency. Having access to Invigorate would allow the deck to threaten damage faster, but not shore up too many of the deck weaknesses that keep it fair. Infect also generally needs a way to protect their creature, given how all-in the strategy is. Without a spell like Snakeskin Veil to counter any target removal, it doesn't matter how big Invigorate makes the creature. Infect is a generally flimsy yet iconic aggro deck that could benefit from a boost without overtaking the meta any more than something like Kuldotha Red or Affinity. which are both fast aggro decks that trade off sheer speed of Infect for more resilience or card advantage. Infect could arguably add more variety to the meta, and would be hampered by the control decks in the format that have arguably never been stronger. Next up is Cloudpost. This land is a locust and enters the battlefield tapped. It can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana for each locust on the battlefield. It was banned from Pauper format in October of 2013. Why was Cloudpost banned? Even though it enters tapped, Cloudpost represents a mana generation engine that's both easy to get going and produces tons of mana. While there's only one other actual locust in Glimmerpost, even just 8 locust lands is enough if you have ways to search them. With even just one other locust, a Cloudpost is now on par with Ancient Tomb, which is among the most powerful lands ever printed. The locust engine was powerful enough that Cloudpost was eventually banned in Modern, and remains a powerful strategy to this day in Legacy. While Pauper lacked the higher rarity ways of getting more loco on the battlefield, like Vesuva, it still provided far too much mana for too little investment. Pauper has no shortage of high mana value spells to be ramped into. To make matters worse, Glitterpost's ability to gain life for each locust on the battlefield whenever it enters the battlefield would help stave off aggro decks and recover in the mid to late game. While Frantic Search had already been banned at this point, there were other ways of untapping lands to even further cheat on mana with Cloudpost, such as Snap. Could Cloudpost be unbanned? No. Pauper currently has access to Urza's Power Plant and the other Urza lands that make up a mana engine commonly known as Tron. Tron is one of the best decks of the format, able to produce a large amount of mana as long as it has at least one of each of the specific named lands on the battlefield. This is harder to assemble than the Locust lands, since as long as you have a Cloudpost, it doesn't matter what the other lands are as long as they're a Locust. Given that Tron has been successful for years and remains a competitive deck to this day, it's hard to imagine a world where Cloudpost's decks wouldn't do basically the same thing, but better. With Tron, if you remove even just one of the names with targeted land destruction, the other lands lose all extra benefits. However, as long as you've got more than one Cloudpost, it's hard to outright deny your mana engine. While you technically had less lands for the Cloudpost engine than the Tron engine, and thus a lower ceiling, in practice, the more streamlined packages makes for more consistent hands. There would be little reason to run Tron over Cloudpost in the format, and if a card being unbanned would completely invalidate one of the most consistently good decks in the format, it's hard to imagine actually unbanning it. Cloudpost is a card that is generally seen as fair in Legacy and far too good in Modern, and unlikely to ever be unbanned there. It's just simply too far out of the power level of Pauper to ever realistically come back, especially since the cards have been banned specifically to limit Tron, and would have been even more problematic with Cloudpost in the format. How could Cloudpost be fixed to be unbanned? Given that Cloudpost works off of the number of loci on the field, the most straightforward way reigning in its power would be to make Cloudpost legendary. Not only would it make the maximum number of loci on the battlefield at any given time go down from 8 to 5, it would make it so only one locust could produce that mana. This would drastically limit the power of the loci, making them more likely an addition to current Tron decks potentially, instead of outright replacing them. The next two cards serve a similar function and were banned within the same year, so will be discussed together. First is Cloud of Faeries, which costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana for a fairy with 1 power and toughness, and the keyword abilities Flying and Cycling. Flying makes it so only other creatures with Flying or Reach can block it, and Cycling allows you to pay 2 generic mana and discard Cloud of Faeries to draw a card. This was rarely used, however, given that Cloud of Faeries has the ability to untap up to 2 lands whenever it entered the battlefield. It was banned in January 2016. Peregrine Drake costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana for a Drake with 2 power, 5 toughness, and the keyword Flying. It untapped up to 5 lands whenever it enters the battlefield and was banned in November 2016. Why were they banned? Both of these cards on paper refund their cost outright, with the 2 mana Cloud of Faeries untapping 2 lands and the 5 mana Drake untapping 5 lands. However, there are many ways to abuse these effects to get ahead on mana. Before it was banned, Cloudpost was a frequent target for both of these untap effects. A cycle of creatures with abilities that reduce the cost of specifically colored spells, such as Sunscape Familiar, made them both cost 1 less, making them even cheaper to cast, yet still untapping the same number of lands. But what pushed these synergies from just powerful bursts of mana that could support other decks into a dedicated combo deck was the prevalence of flicker effects in the format. Ghostly Flicker could make both of these creatures leave and re-enter the battlefield instantly, triggering more untaps and freeing up more mana. Familiars could use Cloud of Faeries and Peregrine Drake as a way to fuel a turn where they'd cast Capsize several turns in one turn with all the extra mana and bounce away all of your opponent's permanents. As other decks like Storm and Infect were banned out of the format, Familiars remained relatively unchecked and quickly became the most dominant threat in the format. Cloud of Faeries was banned first, in part because it saw even further utility in blue aggro decks thanks to its synergy with Spellstutter Sprite. However, it's important to note that a larger reason in Peregrine Drake's escape and abandon initially might have been its inclusion in Eternal Masters, which at the time of Cloud Faeries banning was still an upcoming set. Wizards decided to not ban the card right as about to see a reprint, opting to see if only having one untapper with a much higher mana value would be enough to limit the deck. However, Peregrine Drake proved more than competent as a solo act in Pauper, to a point where it was banned not even a full year later. Even builds that didn't rely on the familiar package saw great success, with dedicated combo builds able to eventually draw through their whole deck in one turn. Ghostly Flicker could target Peregrine Drake and Mnemonic Wall to untap 5 lands and put Ghostly Flicker back in your hand with the walls enter the battlefield effect. Since Ghostly Flicker only costs 3 mana and Peregrine Drake untap 5 lands, you generate infinite mana. Then start flickering the wall and a permanent that draws cards like Mulldrifter. Given that combo builds consistently could pull this off with Peregrine Drake, there was little room for it left in the format. After a few months of experimenting, Peregrine Drake was finally banned. Familiars even still see play without their most effective combo piece, often slotted into new variations of the flickering strategy. Could Cloud of Faeries or Peregrine Drake be unbanned? The answer to this is probably no. In the years since their banning, the options for flicker strategies have only gotten stronger. Ephemerate is a 1-mana flicker spell with the ability to recast itself for free in your next upkeep. This means you can use the initial flicker for your Peregrine Drake, then use the rebounded upkeep copy to flicker Augur or Bolas, or even flicker the Drake again if you have an instant speed use for the mana provided by the untapping. Flicker is already a powerful strategy in the format, able to leverage Murmuring Mystic as a secondary win condition option. Cloud of Faeries would have arguably even more impact on the format, since its lower mana value and synergy with fairy strategies would make it even less of an investment to run and build around than Peregrine Drake. The most surprising thing about these two is that they last in the format for so long, although they can likely be attributed to living in the shadow of Storm. Much like the fellow banned card Frantic Search, these spells that refund themselves just are generally too powerful for the power level of Pauper. Pauper has just enough tools to break the cards, but not enough tools to really dampen and limit these combos like other formats would beyond the classic counterspell. As such, unless Pauper sees some radical shifts in power level and dynamics, it's unlikely these two cards could ever be unbanned. How could they be fixed to be unbanned? The most straightforward answer is to reduce the number of lands both cards untap. Instead of refunding their entire mana value, they could refund around half, with Cloud of Faeries untapping 1 land and Peregrine Drake untapping 2 or 3. This would drastically diminish their ability to be abused, but still leave some of their function as a valuable flicker target. Notably, if Drake can untap 3 lands, this is just enough to pay for Ghostly Flicker repeatedly with the previously mentioned combo. And while it will not generate infinite mana, it does allow you to cast a spell an infinite number of times, and get infinite enters and leaves the battlefield triggers. Balancing cards that untap lands is a tightrope walk, especially in a format like Pauper. If they're too overcorrected, they lose all of their original identity and become unplayable, but just too efficient and they become game-breaking. The next shakeup to Pauper as a format came in the form of 3 bans on the same day, all targeting the same type of strategy but multiple different decks on paper. While these cards were all played together, each were powerful in their own unique ways and should be discussed separately. First, we have Gush. This instant costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana, but can also be cast instead by returning 2 islands you control to your hand. This spell draws 2 cards and was banned in May of 2019. Why was Gush banned? Gush is a card so powerful and complex in its use cases that someone has genuinely written a full-length book theorizing how to best play it. While a 5 mana draw 2 is borderline unplayable in a world with divination, a 0 mana draw 2 that sometimes has more upsides than downsides is extremely playable. If you haven't made your land drop per turn before casting Gush, then you can replay one of those lands and then have 1 extra mana to work with that turn despite having less lands on board. Gush can also be used when digging for interaction, floating the mana you'd need for a counterspell, then hoping to draw it with Gush. It does put you behind on lands, and while that's certainly a notable downside, it's usually worth trading off for the value Gush offers. Especially in the mid to late game where you have more than enough lands on board and don't really care about bouncing a couple. Or those times where you hold up interaction and your opponent doesn't play anything and you hardcast the Gush in their end phase. It allowed for both slower and more aggressive blue decks to refill their hands, with slow decks able to buy the time to rebuild, and aggressive or combo-oriented decks often would try to end the game before the mana deficit mattered. Gush only really struggled in the very early game, and even then it would still be cast in a pinch when the right situation presented itself. While any blue deck could reasonably run it, Delver of Secret decks were the most dominant users of Gush. These decks would go all in on their small, aggressive threats and protect them with counter magic as they grinded their opponent out. Gush was a massive aid in refueling the hands of Delver players after an expensive turn of interacting or in the middle of trying to save a Delver. All 3 of the May 2019 bans would address Delver in some way or another. with Gush aimed to not only limit its draw power, but to rein in blue in general. It had been seen as dominant in the format, and Gush was a key part in what made blue so above the grade of Pauper standards. Could Gush be unbanned? The answer to this is probably no. Gush is one of the most powerful draw spells ever printed. It remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage to this day. A free draw to an instant speed by itself is enough to be far too good, but Gush's downside isn't even always a downside, to a point where when leveraged correctly, it can be a massive swinging advantage even though it sets you back 2 lands behind your opponent. Pauper has access to plenty of powerful draw options that are much fairer. Lorien Revealed is a more recent 5-mana draw spell that draws 3 cards, and while its mana cost can't be cheated, its early game utility comes from having island cycling. You can pay 1 generic and discard to search a library for an island, allowing you to fix your mana in the early game and draw cards in the mid to late game. While much weaker than Gush, it has seen plenty of play since its printing. And with cards like Mulldrifter as consistent staples of the format, there's no urgency to bring back Gush to the format. Pauper has plenty of card draw without including one of the most powerful draw spells ever that just so happened to have a common printing. How could Gush be fixed to be unbanned? Gush is an extremely powerful card that finds its main strength in its most unique gimmick. If you remove its alternative casting cost, then Gush would be a fairly unplayable draw spell. Instead, it might be more fair if Gush had to bounce 2 untapped islands instead of just any 2 islands, making it more of a hit to your mana advantage to actually cast the spell for free. Or if you didn't want to limit it in that way, you could make it need to bounce more lands. At 3 or 4 lands bounce, it would be much harder to consistently be able to justify casting it for free. Gush might even still be playable if it only bounced 3 lands, although it would be much slower card, more relegated to control shells and aggressive Delver decks. The only other realistic way of reining in Gush's power would be to remove its alternative cost altogether, and find some other way of differentiating it from divination. Next is Gitaxian Probe. This sorcery costs 1 Phyrexian in blue mana, which can be paid with 1 blue mana or 2 life. It allows you to look at target player's hand, then draw a card. It was also banned in May of 2019. Why was Gitaxian Probe banned? Pauper has access to some of the most powerful cantrips in Magic, such as Brainstorm. Gitaxian Probe beats out these all-star cantrips by technically not costing any mana. In almost every instance, Gitaxian Probe will be cast for 2 life, freeing up your mana to cast something like the other cantrips in your deck. It also provides free hand information, and while it doesn't let you interact with your opponent's hand, the free information allows you to play around their best cards, or know what to hold your counter magic for. Gitaxian Probe replaces itself with a card, doesn't cost any mana, and lets you know every card your opponent currently has. Other cards that replace themselves for free have seen play in multiple formats due to essentially allowing your deck to functionally have less cards in it. Probe offers that with an upside, leading it to arguably being the most powerful cantrip ever printed. It's banned to this day in Modern and Legacy and also restricted in Vintage. Given the power blue decks in the format, Wizards chose to hit Gitaxian Probe without hitting any more of the other fair cantrips that actually cost mana. These bans were leveraged to rein in the power of Delver without actually killing the deck. Considering that you didn't even have to be playing a blue deck to run Gitaxian Probe, however, its problems in the format extended far past Delver. Any deck in Pauper that could afford to lose a life could run Gitaxian Probe before its banning. While not every deck would want to play Gitaxian Probe, it would be easily included in several decks to this very day. Could Gitaxian Probe be unbanned? The answer to this is no. Pauper has no shortage of powerful blue spells, and Delver, the deck Gitaxian Probe was banned in part to hit, is still competent and viable to this day. With access to Ponder and other 1-mana cantrips, Pauper already has cantrips quality on par with Legacy for the most part, and with Gitaxian Probe would genuinely have more access to powerful cantrips than Vintage. While Pauper has less payoffs for these cards, there's no good reason to let Gitaxian Probe off the list when Pauper has plenty of powerful cantrips without it. How could Gitaxian Probe be fixed to be unbanned? Probe being a free spell is what pushes it too far. If it costs even just 1 generic and 1 Phyrexian blue mana, this spell would still be quite strong. Arguably too good for Pauper, but far less overtuned than what it currently is. Another option is remove the handpeak option altogether and reduce the card to just a cantrip for 1 Phyrexian mana. While this would remove a key mechanic of the card, the lack of free hand knowledge would make the card simply an efficient cantrip and not always a way to gather information. Changing the Phyrexian blue mana to just a normal blue mana in the cost would also limit the card to only being playable in decks that actually are able to cast blue spells. It would also limit Delver's turn 1 plays to either a cantrip or playing a creature, instead of doing both thanks to Probe being free. The last card of these Delver-oriented bans is Daze. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana, but could also be cast by returning an island you control to your hand instead of paying its mana cost. Daze counters target spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana, and the card was banned in May of 2019. Why was Daze banned? Of the 3 cards hit in May of 2019, this was the one most specifically powerful in Delver. These Delver of Secret decks are built to protect their namesake 1-drop, meaning that on their first turn, after tapping out to cast that Delver, they're the most vulnerable. Daze allows you to counter any 1-mana removal spell they might have had without having any mana held up. While you'd be behind on mana going forward, you protected your threat and were able to keep applying pressure on the next turn. Of course, this was far from the only application for Daze. Much like with Gush, it essentially being a free spell made it a potent option for many decks to be able to run it. Force Spike by itself is an underwhelming card, but in the early game if your opponent is playing their mana curve optimally, you'll have multiple chances to catch a key spell with Daze. Combo decks often rely on casting multiple spells a turn, and sometimes just genuinely don't have the extra mana to spare. But these combo decks could also use Daze to try and insulate their plays, since bouncing a land wouldn't matter much if the play wins you the game. Much like Gush and Gitaxian Probe, this was a card that was a problem in multiple decks, but helped prop Delver decks up as the undisputed best deck in the format. Each of the 3 helped Delver escape from tight spots, and were banned to help make the deck less reliant and more prone to counterplay. Could Daze ever be unbanned? The answer to this is no. Since Daze's banning, not only has Delver remained relevant, but more decks have entered the format which might use Daze. Multiple combo decks exist in the format that could use Daze to insulate their plays. While it's arguably the most likely to be unbanned of the trio, its ability to protect Delver when it should otherwise be shielded down makes it a tough sell. Delver's mana efficiency makes it hard to fully combat, and Daze pushes that even further. And even though a 2-mana Force Spike isn't ideal, it's still fairly efficient as far as spells go, and not impossible to hardcast and still find value even in the first few turns. How could Daze be fixed to be unbanned? As with Gush, changing the effect to need to bounce an untapped land would drastically limit the card's effectiveness. Delver would no longer be able to protect their turn 1 play, yet Daze would still find some marginal use in the early to mid game. Other changes wouldn't do much to fix the card, since the actual counter effect is already somewhat weak, but a weak counter spell is still fairly strong when it's free. Maybe if it needed to tap more lands, it could be more fair. That's another way to prevent it from being so good so early, but would still give it plenty of play in the mid to late game given how Gush's cost of 2 lands was manageable in practice. This video will finish going through some of the cards that were banned after already existing for an extended time in the Pauper metagame. We'll also touch on how multiplayer design mechanics often led to cards being banned in the format as we cover the last few cards of this list and some of the most recent bans in the format. First, we have Sojourner's Companion. This artifact creature costs 7 generic mana for a salamander with 4 power and toughness. It has affinity for artifacts, which reduces its mana cost by the number of artifacts you control. By paying 2 generic mana and discarding Soldier's Companion, you can use its artifact land cycling ability to search your library for an artifact land card and add it to your hand. It was banned in Pauper in September of 2021. Why was Sojourner's Companion banned? Affinity has been a very powerful deck in Pauper for years, in part thanks to its access to the artifact lands. As both lands and artifacts, they essentially account for double mana when casting an affinity spell like Thoughtcast. These artifact lands are banned in Modern, given they push the speed and consistency of those decks over the edge. However, Pauper lacks cards like Mox Opal that really push the artifact lands into being unfair, and instead make up the backbone of Pauper's Affinity's game plan. Pauper even got new dual-color artifact lands in the form of the Bridge Cycle that came in the same set as Sojourner's Companion. These lands can turn on abilities like Metalcraft and pay for costs that require sacrificing an artifact in a pinch. As such, the land cycling abilities of Sojourner's Companion was invaluable in the early game. 3-color affinity decks had a way of searching whatever color they were missing, as well as increasing their artifact count. And the more artifacts you have, the less mana it will cost to cast the future copies of Sojourner's Companion, and get aggressive with the undercosted creatures. While affinity decks at the time were not the most dominant decks, it was found that Affinity's win rate against anything but the best deck in the format was way too high. As such, when they banned Chatterstorm to hit Storm, they also had to ban an Affinity card as well to prevent it from becoming the new best deck. Sojourner's Companion had been in the format for over a year at this point, and while it was by no means the most powerful card in Affinity, it smoothed out the deck's draws and made the actual power of the decks even more potent. And in an attempt to preserve Affinity's unique playstyle in the format, they opted to ban Sojourner's Companion in hopes that lower the deck's consistency would be enough to keep it from dominating the format. Could Sojourner's Companion be unbanned? No. Affinity would quickly prove to still be playable even without Sojourner's Companion. More Affinity cards would eventually be added to the ban list that we'll discuss shortly, but even despite multiple hits after Sojourner's Companion, Affinity remains a top tier deck in Pauper. If Sojourner's Companion got unbanned, it would simply slot right back into Grixis Affinity decks and help fix the mana needed to cast Kenku Artificer on turn 3 after casting a removal spell of a different color the turn prior. Currently, 3-color Affinity sees less play than the 2-color blue-white builds. This is in part because it's easier to ensure you'll be able to cast all your spells as quickly as possible. Ash Barrens and other land cycling cards in the format allow other decks access to mana fixing that Affinity does not have without Sojourner's Companion. It is the only card with artifact land cycling, and no other piece of efficient mana fixing for Affinity could double so easily as an efficient attacker. While it's not the most powerful Affinity card on the ban list, it's hard to imagine unbanning it given how it shores up one of the deck's more glaring weaknesses. That said, if any cards were to be unbanned for Affinity, it would be likely Sojourner's Companion, given its general lower power level compared to the other Affinity hits that came after it. How could Sojourner's Companion be fixed to be unbanned? While it would strip away a good bit of what makes the card unique, the ability to artifact land cycle is what really pushes it over the edge. A 7 mana Affinity creature is still playable, but not the most exciting card, serving a function most similar to Gurmag Angler in Pauper control decks. However, the addition of relevant land cycling modes push it from just a playable threat to a card that is live at pretty much every stage of the game. Of the two abilities to remove, taking away the land cycling would limit it the most while still leaving room for it to see play in actual Pauper builds. The next Affinity ban came the next year with Atog. It costs 1 generic and 1 red mana and has 1 power and 2 toughness. Atog's ability allows you to sacrifice an artifact to give Atog +2 power and toughness until end of turn. It was banned from Pauper in January of 2022. Why was Atog banned? Affinity remained dominant in the format even after the banning of Sojourner's Companion, to the point where decks began mainboarding Dust to Dust and other artifact hit cards to counteract the deck. Pauper Affinity had one of the best win rates, and the highest play percentage in the format with every deck either played Affinity or built in some way to try to beat it. Atog in particular provided a solid win condition. While nowhere near as powerful as Arcbound Ravager, having even a comparable beater at common made it a real threat in the format. But Atog was rarely played fairly, and often instead gave Affinity a more combo-centric game plan to go for. Fling lets you sacrifice a creature to let it deal its power as damage to any target, meaning if you sacrificed enough artifacts to get Atog's power higher than your opponent's life, you could fling it for lethal. This alone would have been good, but the recent introduction of Wedding Invitation to Pauper provided a way to give Atog unblockable that synergized with the rest of the deck. Strong opening hands with Atog could kill within the first few turns, usually when coupled with Disciple of the Vault to heap on even more damage. Affinity could fairly consistently hit 20 damage early, and in ways that were not easily interacted with. Some Grixis builds of Affinity even managed to protect their Atog combo turns with interaction like Metallic Rebuke. Modern Horizons 2 had pushed Affinity so far over the edge that its old win conditions were now easier to pull off than ever. Atog was chosen as a ban to try and push Affinity back to running more fair threats like Carapace Forger and to disincentivize the more combo-oriented plays Affinity had moved towards. Atog didn't force you to build your deck to be any less aggressive, and instead offered fast combo lines built into an otherwise competent aggro deck. Could Atog be unbanned? Probably not. Pauper Affinity has generally moved away from the aggressive combo piles that Atog helped facilitate. Not only has this taken multiple cards being banned to accomplish, Atog is undoubtedly the strongest of them. If Atog were to return, the All That Glitters variant of the decks would likely be pushed aside for decks closer in construction to those fast combo builds. Some builds of Affinity like Grixis have fallen out of favor lately, but with Atog back in the format, cards like Blood Fountain would see far more success than they do currently. Unbanning Atog would simply backslide the format right back where it was in 2022. There are some that argue that Affinity could use more bans, so the idea of actually unbanning Atog anytime soon feels unrealistic. All bringing back Atog would do is give an already powerful deck the tools to also play a combo with the right hands. How could Atog be fixed to be unbanned? Given the multiple routes of dealing direct damage with Atog and Pauper, the most reasonable solution would be to limit how many times you can activate Atog's ability. In recent years, there have been more Magic cards with restrictions on how many times you can activate a card's ability in a single turn. If Atog's ability could only be used at sorcery speed, it would not only make it easier to interact with Atog, but would prevent Atog from ever being used as an effective blocker, and force the card to almost always play aggro. This would still likely be powerful, so one might consider actively limiting the activations of Atog to only 1 or 2 activations per turn. This would drastically reduce the card's overall playability, but given its use as a combo tool is what makes it so good, it's an important issue to try and address. 2 other cards are banned at the same time of Atog. These cards were both unassuming at the surface, yet for very similar reasons pushed another deck far ahead of the rest of the format. The first is Bonder's Ornament, an artifact that costs 3 generic mana and can tap for 1 mana of any color. You can also pay 4 generic mana and tap Bonder's Ornament to make each player who controls a permanent named Bonder's Ornament draw a card. The second is Prophetic Prism, which costs 2 generic mana and draws a card whenever it enters the battlefield. You can pay 1 generic mana and tap Prophetic Prism to add 1 mana of any color. Both cards were banned in January of 2022. Why were these cards banned? While Affinity was the most popular deck and boasted one of the best win rates in the format, Tron decks actually managed a higher average win rate in the format. While this was in part thanks to most decks focusing their sideboards to beat Affinity and not Tron, the fact remained that Tron was a contender with Affinity in the format, and would be even more powerful once Affinity was weakened. Built around the Urza lands, these decks would leap ahead on mana and aim to have 7 or more mana as early as turn 3. As such, Wizards considered several bans, like crop rotation, potentially limit the deck's ability to access its signature lands. However, they decided to instead hit both Bonder's Ornament and Prophetic Prism because of how easily they both allow Tron to fix their mana. Typically, Tron is able to produce a lot of mana, but is more limited by the cards they're able to cast with it, given a large chunk of the mana bases needed to be colorless. While manaless style cards that tap for mana have existed in Pauper for years, both Prophetic Prism and Bonder's Ornament draw you a card and essentially replace themselves, putting them more on par with the already banned Arkham's Astrolabe. Bonder's Ornament in particular is problematic given its card draw was repeatable. It didn't help that Bonder's Ornament was only printed in common due to a technicality. Cards that are printed in every deck during a set of commander precons are typically printed as commons, so Bonder's Ornament was a common in those decks despite having a power level not exactly intended for Pauper. Prophetic Prism was banned as well due to the lower mana value offering Tron more access to all 5 colors quicker. Without access to these 2 powerful artifacts, Tron would have to decide 2 or 3 colors to focus on instead of getting to play whatever spells they wanted regardless of color. Could these cards ever be unbanned? The answer to that is probably no. Tron remains a powerful deck with multiple variants in the format. Some build more around powerful sack outlets like Ashnod's Altar, while others play towards powerful game-ending threats like Pauper All-Star, Ulamog's Crusher. Different builds of Tron require different colors of mana to function, and only really exist separate from one another thanks to Tron's inability to play every color at once. If Tron had access to Bonder's Ornament and the like again, then any build of Tron could run a win condition like Denrova Horror, without any need to build their deck around doing so. Instead of having to focus on a specific version of Tron, they'd be able to flex into anything given what the meta called for at the time. At the time these cards were banned, Tron already made great use of mystical teachings to search out specific cards they needed. This powerful card is the backbone of many control strategies, and a version of Tron that still exists today. But with Bonder's Ornament giving you access to every color of mana for minimal cost, mystical teachings could search up any silver bullet hate card from the sideboard that you could possibly want. Prophetic Prism also notably provides Flicker combo decks another playable artifact that draws a card on entering the battlefield, and would likely bolster those strategies as well. Mana fixing is weaker in Pauper than most other sanctioned formats. Arkham's Astrolabe set a precedent for how mana fixing artifacts can sometimes be a bit too powerful for the format. And while these two only really saw play in dedicated decks and didn't warp the format like Astrolabe, they're still too good to reasonably come back. How could they both be fixed to be unbanned? Bonder's Ornament in particular is hard because it's not really meant for Pauper in the first place. At surface level, an easy option would be to make the card draw ability cost more mana to activate. But if any deck could play through that nerf, it would be Tron. You'd have to make it cost at least 6 mana to draw a card. And even then, Tron would still likely run it for the mana fixing and use the card draw only to refill an empty hand. A more realistic nerf for both of this and Prophetic Prism would be to limit the mana filtering. If they could only tap for a color of land you control, it would still help fix mana, but still force players to commit to a mana base. Freely filtering into any color while also replacing itself just provides too much for the format. Yet if you just remove the card draw, these cards become worse than cards like Manalith, which are already unplayable in the format. It's a fine line to walk for balancing, especially in the case of Bonder's Ornament, which arguably should have never been printed in the format at all. Prophetic Prism itself is easier to balance, especially if the colors it could tap for were limited, yet both are far from healthy for the format. The next Pauper ban came in the form of another hit to Affinity. Disciple of the Vault is a human cleric that costs 1 black mana and has 1 power and toughness. Whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. It was banned from Pauper in March of 2022. Why was Disciple of the Vault banned? Alongside Atog, Disciple of the Vault was one of the main cards which facilitated fast, non-combat kills for Affinity. The two worked in tandem, with Atog sacrificing artifacts to gain power, while Disciple of the Vault pinged the opponent for each one. Wizards assumed removing Atog would be enough to dampen the control potential for the deck. Instead, Affinity just focused even more on Disciple of the Vault, adding cards like Krark-Clan Shaman to main boards just to have access to another artifact sack outlet. The Atog ban did little to actually lessen Affinity's play rate. At the time of Disciple of the Vault's banning, Affinity had the highest play rate in Pauper on MTG Online, with almost twice as much representation as the second most played deck. Disciple of the Vault escaped being banned alongside Atog since the Wizards didn't want to overcorrect the format. Instead, they wound up overcorrecting and left Affinity with a win condition that was difficult to interact with and far too fast. While other cards like Deadly Dispute have proven potent in Affinity and worth considering for a ban, it was clear the combo side of Affinity was the most glaring problem with the deck. With Disciple banned, Affinity was forced to go back to focusing on combat to secure a win. Now Affinity relies on more conventional win conditions like a Gear Seeker Serpent that requires investment to play and win via combat. Disciple of the Vault was a win condition that could be played on turn 1 and slowly used to grind down your opponent before suddenly going for the kill with one big combo turn. While Atog was the more explosive of the two cards, Disciple of the Vault was able to dominate the format all by itself. Could Disciple of the Vault be unbanned? Probably no. Much like Atog, a Disciple of the Vault facilitates a fast, more combo-oriented playstyle for Affinity that's just too fast for Pauper. Affinity still exists as a deck, and if anything, has more varied playstyles and variants now that the centralized best options have been banned. There are too many powerful synergies around sacrificing artifacts for Disciple of the Vault to ever come off the ban list, and not just instantly become the best thing to do for various existing artifact decks. All unbanning Disciple of the Vault would do is take already existing decks and give them more opening hands that can kill you in the first couple of turns. A hand with multiple Disciple of the Vaults can easily snowball out of control. Since it only costs 1 mana, Disciple of the Vault can pressure their opponent's life total quickly, and get in plenty of chip damage before any combos are even in play. Pauper is a format that has been defined for years by synergies with artifacts, to a point where Disciple of the Vault realistically can't ever return. How could Disciple of the Vault be fixed to be unbanned? The most glaring issue with Disciple of the Vault is its low mana value. Pauper, being a format of commons, often lacks sheer mana efficiency, especially when it comes to threats and win conditions. Affinity without Disciple of the Vault focuses on using a high artifact count to make cards like Mirror Enforcer playable. But since Disciple is so low to the ground and offers such a powerful effect, the deck can build around these fast kills. With a mana value of 4 or 5, Disciple of the Vault would be a much more reasonable card, taking time and mana to set up and especially limit one's ability to cast multiple copies. This would still likely be a playable card, but would also be more appropriately costed as a top-end win condition instead of a card you can begin the game with. Beyond everything discussed in this and the previous videos, the last kind of card on the Pauper ban list are the cards that were cards designed for multiplayer that were too good for Pauper. Bonder's Ornament was a card that was too strong for Pauper that happened to be in a multiplayer product at common, whereas these next cards were designed with unique mechanics meant for multiplayer that wound up being far too good in Pauper. The first of which is Fall from Favor. This aura enchantment costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana and can enchant target creature. When Fall from Favor enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature and you become the monarch. The enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step unless the player is the monarch. It was banned from Pauper in January of 2021. Why was Fall from Favor banned? The monarch mechanic has been a controversial inclusion in Pauper since its introduction in Conspiracy Take the Crown. At the start of the game, no player is the monarch until a card, like Fall from Favor, grants that player monarch. When you're the monarch, you draw a card at the beginning of the end step, and whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, its controller becomes the monarch. This mechanic was intended for multiplayer games where 4 players could all compete for a monarch. The monarch would typically have to stave off attacks from 3 other players to keep their card advantage. In a 1v1 format like Pauper, however, there's just the one opponent, and as such, it's far easier to defend your monarchy. This alone led to many of her calling for cards like Entourage of Trust to potentially get banned. And while the mechanic itself has not been outright banned, Fall from Favor was deemed too powerful. For one, its mana value at 3 puts it at a better rate than some of the format's other monarch enablers. Beyond this, most every other monarch spell in Pauper offers minimal upsides or no upside at all. Commander Masters brought back the monarch mechanic and at the same time essentially created a removal spell in the form of Fall from Favor. If you enchanted a Gurmag Angler, then it would only ever untap if its controller became the monarch. And since their best attacker is now tapped down, it's much less likely they'll be able to connect and take back the monarch. Essentially, Fall from Favor both gave you the monarch and helped protect the monarchy all at once, providing you removal and draw power as a bonus. Aggro decks were simply pushed out of the format entirely because they wouldn't be able to keep up with the pressure of these slower decks, and would eventually run out of steam once the monarch began drawing the controller player cards every turn. The only real aggressive decks that had much success were the mono blue aggro decks that also ran the card and took full advantage of it as the best removal spell in the format. While Monarch has remained in the format as a whole, Fall from Favor showed that it doesn't take much for a card with Monarch to be too good. Could Fall from Favor be unbanned? Probably not. As stated above, Monarch is already a mechanic that has proven polarizing. Not only is Fall from Favor too low in mana value, it provides too much in-game value over the course of the game to come back. Blue decks in the format already have tools like the Ninja package to draw cards. These same decks are also home to the best evasive creatures in the format like Spellstutter Sprite, and would simply use Fall from Favor to further snowball advantage to remove creatures with flying or reach. Aggro decks in the format would struggle to play against it, and blue would likely overtake the format as the only color that can really win a full-on aggressive match, which is generally not the space blue inhabits in a format. Fall from Favor simply stifles too many other decks and strategies to not warp the format around it. How could Fall from Favor be fixed to be unbanned? Fall from Favor should not function as a removal spell in Pauper. If it tapped down a creature for just a single turn, then it would allow for a swing and tempo without invalidating the creature outright. Stun counters are a good example of a more recent design innovation that helped fix Fall from Favor, replacing this conditional tap effect with giving the creature at enchant a stun counter. This would make the card far less powerful, but simply being a 3-mana permanent that gives you Monarch is arguably enough for it to at least have some serious play consideration by itself. Monarch is so powerful in Pauper that a card offering much more than just the Monarch itself is generally too good. Finally, the last cards we have to go over are a group of 4 cards that all share the same mechanic. First is Aarakocra Sneak, a bird rogue which costs 3 generic and 1 blue mana and has 1 power and 4 toughness. Stirring Bard is a dragon bard that costs 3 generic and 1 red mana and has 0 power and 4 toughness. Vicious Battle Rager is a dwarf barbarian that costs 3 generic and 1 black mana. And finally, Underdark Explorer is a lizard warrior that costs 4 generic and 1 black mana and has 5 power and 3 toughness. Each one has their own keywords or secondary abilities, but the most important thing that ties these cards together is that when they enter the battlefield, you take the initiative. The initiative is a mechanic similar to the Monarch, where once a player has it, another player may take it by dealing combat damage to them. Whenever you take the initiative, and at the beginning of your upkeep while you have it, you venture into Undercity. Each time you do, you progress down a path and trigger the effect of whatever room you entered. They were banned from Pauper in September of 2022. Why were these initiative cards banned? The initiative keyword was designed specifically for multiplayer drafts and Commander and had many of the same issues Monarch did with translating to Pauper. Only having to stave off one opponent to keep the initiative meant that it was likely for players to snowball an entire game with it. Many of the options in the Undercity are balanced for multiplayer specifically as well, such as the trap option in Undercity making target player lose 5 life. In the Commander format, where you start with 40 life, that's not a huge loss. Meanwhile, in Pauper, that's a fourth of your starting life gone in just one trigger. Monarch was powerful for just drawing you a card every turn, whereas Initiative offers everything from card selection to mana production to creature production. Venturing into the Undercity multiple times is a quick way to overwhelm your opponent and overtake the entire game. Many established decks in the format opted to include their in-color initiative cards, such as Delver and Faeries adopting Aarakocra Sneak. More problematic for the format, however, were the decks focused on playing these initiative cards often and as early as possible. Dark Ritual is one of the backbone power cards of Pauper, one that has been considered for bans multiple times but always escapes given its prominence and popularity in the format. It, alongside Lotus Petal, would provide enough mana to cast any of the 4-mana initiative creatures, which was the lowest mana value available in Pauper for initiative on the first turn of the game. From there, already head on board, you'd usually ride that advantage to an early win. It was decided that, on the 7 cards legal in Pauper that granted initiative, 4 of them had to be banned. Every 4-drop initiative creature was banned, leaving Trailblazer's Torch legal due to it being somewhat underwhelming as an equipment. 5-mana initiative creatures like Goliath Paladin are just enough slower to set up that they were deemed as not an issue and left in the format. The only initiative creature with a mana value higher of 4 to be unbanned was Underdark Explorer. It had the best stats of any of the initiative commons, and while 5 mana was a bit much, black decks in the format were most generally willing to spend the mana thanks to Dark Ritual. Blue-black decks entirely focused on initiative used Underdark Explorer as their primary win condition, and as such, it too was banned. Now, could the initiative cards be unbanned? Probably not. As the most recent cards banned in Pauper, these cards have not had the time to show they aren't a problem. In the wake of these bannings, the unplayed initiative spells like Goliath Paladin wound up being slotted into a few decks and strategies without warping the format. Taking these spells off the ban list roughly a year after banning them, where their strictly worse counterpart still sees play, just doesn't make sense. Initiative as a mechanic has proven powerful enough that higher rarity initiative cards have seen play and gotten even banned in formats like Legacy. The mechanic is incredibly strong in a 1 versus 1 match, with many of its abilities balanced for multiplayer, with the assumption that these cards would never see play in any competitive formats. But in practice, Initiative has proven to be a mechanic powerful enough it can carry you to a game win almost entirely by itself. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? The only feasible answer for these cards without removing initiative would be to make their mana values higher across the board. 5-mana initiative cards see limited success in the format already, so it would be safer if these cards increase their mana values by 2, bumping them up to 6 drops on average. This would drastically limit their playability in decks not built around cheating out mana, but given that these spells are only played because they trigger initiative as fast as possible, it's really the only change that could be made. The August 26 ban list features a change in almost every competitive format of Magic, most of which are cards players have been asking Wizards to take action on for a long time. Considering that this is a pretty large ban list with some very interesting cards on it, we should just go ahead and get started. The ban announcement starts with some news about when they'll be making ban lists from now on. with the next scheduled one to be on December 16th of this year, and explains that they'll be having the ban list coincide with the regional championships and regional championship qualifiers instead of the release of a new set. It then proceeds on to Standard, which has very recently undergone rotation and is generally agreed upon to be in an alright place at the moment. After talking about some of the changes in the format caused by rotation, they stated they currently see no issues with the format. That brings us to Pioneer, where 2 cards have been banned. The first is Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. This is a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It can +1 to have target creature you control gain both lifelink and death touch until end of turn. Then if it was a vampire, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. The other +1 lets you sacrifice a vampire, and when you do, it deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. Finally, the -3 lets you put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield, no ifs, ands, or buts. Sorin is obviously a kindred payoff for vampires, which for most of its lifespan wasn't much of an issue. That was until the printing of Vein Ripper in Murder at Karlov Manor. This is a massive 6/5 vampire for 3 and 3 black. It has flying and ward to sacrifice a creature, meaning that if your opponent targets it, they have to sacrifice a creature or the spell gets countered. Finally, whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Vein Ripper is an incredibly powerful card, balanced around its high mana value of 6. When being cast normally, it's perfectly fair. However, being able to get Ripper out on turn 3 with Sorin is difficult if not impossible for almost any deck to deal with. Not only do you need a removal spell that can kill the Ripper that early into the game, you also need to have fodder to be able to remove Ripper at all. Now, if this were an all-in combo deck, this wouldn't be that big a deal. You could simply find the removal spell, let it drain you for a bit of life, and 2-for-1 you, and be done with it, as you'll probably be in a good spot for the rest of the game. Unfortunately, both of these cards were more than capable of being played in red-black mid-range shells, which were already one of the best fair decks in the format. This led to the rise of a deck called Red-Black Vampires, a powerful mid-range deck that just happened to have a broken combo in it. This made the Vein Ripper combo much worse in 2 ways. The first is that the deck was already playing cards like Thoughtseize and Duress, allowing them to look at your opponent's hand and take key cards. If they drew the combo, you could say goodbye to any removal you had that could stop Ripper. On the other hand, they also had lots of spot removal like Fatal Push, so they would also spend the first couple of turns removing anything you played if they weren't ripping cards out of your hand. This means that it can be hard to stick a creature on the field for when the Ripper comes down, which you need in order to be able to play Ripper's ward cost. The second big issue is that the deck also had a ton of other threats to contend with even after you killed Ripper. If you get past the Sorin combo, then your opponent could probably just play Fable of the Mirrorbreaker or Sheoldred the Apocalypse, cards that are honestly pretty close to Vein Ripper in terms of needing to be removed immediately. So, after you lose part of your board and removal spell to do with Ripper, having to do so through all of your opponent's interaction, they can just play another huge threat that you have to remove immediately or lose on the spot. This is without even mentioning that we still have Sorin in this scenario, who can start using his abilities to buff their board and maybe even cheat out another Vein Ripper if you don't find a way to kill him quickly. While the deck didn't have many ways to find the combo more quickly, and drawing it was pretty inconsistent, it was essentially just the same Rakdos mid-range deck that had been on top of the meta for months before the combo was released. It just now could also steal games out of nowhere on top of being one of the best decks in the format. This combo had been around for quite a while, around 6 months at the time of banning, and Wizards has seen enough to believe the metagame forces aren't going to curb the deck's dominance over the format. The only question at this point is what to ban, and out of Sorin and Vein Ripper, Sorin is the more problematic card. Being able to cheat out any vampire means that, as soon as another vampire gets printed with a similar impact in the game to Vein Ripper, Sorin could just come back to stealing games again. Wizards usually prefers to ban the enabler in combos and not the payoff, so they've banned Sorin to stop the combo. Black-red midrange will still continue to be good in Pioneer, just now with normal threats and planeswalkers. For the most part, people are on board with this ban. Black-red midrange decks didn't need the help to be competitive, and losing because your opponent opened a cracked hand always feels awful. The second card banned in Pioneer is Amalia Benavides Aguirre. This is a 2/2 legendary vampire scout for 1 white and 1 black. It has Ward to pay 3 life and the ability where, whenever you gain life, Amalia explores. Then, if her power is exactly 20, you destroy all other creatures. To explore, you reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you put it into your hand. Otherwise, you either leave it on top or mill it and put a +1/+1 counter on Amalia. On its own, Amalia is only an average card. It's a good upgrade to a Johnny's Pridemate, but it's nothing ban-worthy. However, Amalia has a very particular interaction with the card Wild Growth Walker. This is a 1/3 for 1/1 green that has the ability where, Whenever a creature you control explores, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and gain 3 life. With the 2 cards next to each other, the combo becomes pretty obvious. You gain life or explore. Then one of the other 2 will trigger. If Amalia explores, it will trigger Walker, which will gain you life, causing Amalia to explore again. This will loop over and over until Amalia hits 20 power, which will cause her board wipe ability to trigger and kill the Wild Growth Walker. At this point, you now have a 20 powered creature on board and just killed literally everything else. If Amalia can attack, then that's just game right there. This interaction wasn't just powerful, it was very easy to assemble thanks to the multitude of cards that either search one of the combo pieces or could revive them from the graveyard. Collected Company and Court of Calling could find them from your library, and Return to the Ranks, Extraction Specialists, and Lively Dirge could all reanimate either piece of the combo, or even both in the case of Return and Lively Dirge. You also had cards like Selfless Savior and Selfless Spirit, which could be sacrificed to give your creatures indestructible to save them from removal, which both made the combo harder to stop and caused some problems. You see, the Amalia Wild Growth Walker loop is forced. You can't choose to not trigger the abilities once the loop starts. This normally isn't an issue because Amalia will eventually destroy the Walker and free you from the loop. But if Walker has indestructible and is therefore immune to destruction, the loop will just go on forever. This means that the game will end in a draw as the loop can't stop. This has been used by some opponents to stop Amalia players from being able to kill them on their combo turn, but it can also just be used to draw the game if you're on Amalia and don't think you'll be able to win if you don't combo on that very turn. Essentially, what we have here is a powerful combo deck that's very hard to beat, and also a deck that forces a lot of draws, both on accident and on purpose, which can stall rounds in tournaments. None of this is a great outcome for the game, so Amalia has been on Wizards' chopping block for a while. At this point, Wizards has seen enough to say the combo will not be stopped without intervention, and to ban Amalia. They do state that they have their eyes on a couple of other cards of Pioneer as well. Fable of Mirrebreaker and Treasure Cruise are independently some of the most powerful cards in the format, and have enabled decks for as long as they've been available. However, after banning 2 very powerful decks from the format, it's uncertain where the meta will head. So Wizards states they don't want to make any more drastic action in the format until the next ban list at least. So the cards are at least safe until December. Additionally, these exact changes have also gone through in the Explorer format, Magic Arena's version of the Pioneer format, which is similar in terms of metagame, but not identical. All of the cards that allow these combos to work were still on the client, however. And that's it for the Pioneer format. And now we move on to the really juicy part of the ban list announcement with Modern. First off is Nadu Winged Wisdom. Toucan Sam here is a 3/4 for 1/1 green and 1 blue. It has flying in the ability where all creatures you control will gain the following ability. Whenever this creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice per turn. Unfortunately, that last part of the text is a lie. While most would assume that means the ability triggers twice per turn in general, what it actually means is that it triggers twice per turn per creature. Now, this means that Nadu can trigger a lot. But how are you getting all of those triggers? Casting a combat trick for every single trigger doesn't sound all that powerful. That's where Shuko comes in. This is a 1-mana artifact equipment that gets +1/+0 on the equipped creature, but more importantly, costs 0 to activate. This means that you can pay no mana to target something with Shuko's ability, which will trigger Nadu and let you either ramp out a land or draw a card. With these 2 cards in play, you'll get to do this twice for every creature you have every turn. But we're not done yet. This ability will apply to all of your creatures, no matter when they enter the field. So if you can find a way to make more creatures, you can keep digging through your deck. That's where Springheart Nantuko comes in. This is a 1/1 enchantment creature for 2 mana who has a few abilities. But the important thing for right now is that whenever a land enters under your control, it will make us a 1/1 token creature. We can target this token with Shuko to draw 2 more cards or ramp 2 more lands. And the odds are we'll find another land to make yet another token. Once you get going, you can probably do this as much as you want. Eventually, you'll find Endurance, Sylvan Safekeeper, and another copy of Springheart Nantuko, and likely have the mana to cast them. Endurance allows you to have target player put all cards in the graveyard on the bottom of their deck when it enters. Nantuko can actually be attached to a creature and make token copies of it off its landfall trigger, which can let you put your graveyard on the bottom of your library any number of times. The final piece is Safekeeper, which allows you to sacrifice your lands. Once you have an Endurance in play with a Springheart Nantuko on it and a Safekeeper, you'll be able to sacrifice your tapped lands to put them into your graveyard. Then every time you hit a land, you'll be able to put those lands back into your deck to draw them off of Nadu again, essentially giving you a little loop you can do to untap your lands. This loop allows you to draw your entire deck and make infinite mana with enough repetition. And once you do that, you can win basically however you want. Eventually, this will let you channel both Senju Indoors and Otowa Sorin Cities infinite times to get rid of all your opponent's non-basic lands and bounce their entire field and gain infinite life by looping Haywire Might. But the exact details are convoluted and unnecessary to know for the purpose of this discussion. You also do draw your entire deck by doing this, so you'll have all of your lands in play and any 7 card hand you could want after doing this combo. So it's not like your opponent can punish you. This was, well, ridiculous. It was very hard to beat the deck as it was a very resilient combo that had outs to basically any hate card before they could be relevant. Similar to Amalia, it also caused lots of issues logistically. The combo was horribly long and convoluted, and it was very difficult to track every moving part of it. It also took a very long time to perform, which could hold up tournaments if the players didn't simply scoop once it started. All of this led to the card being banned after only 73 days in the modern format. Now, there's a lot to discuss here, which is probably why the lead designer for the set, Michael Majors, wrote a companion piece to the ban announcement explaining Nadu's design history and why this was allowed to be print in the state it was. Ultimately, the card was a big mistake, and something Wizards should have caught before it went to print. Hopefully, Modern Horizons 4 won't introduce yet another Commander-focused legend that ends up destroying the Modern format. The second card banned in Modern is Grief, the second banned member of the Evoke Elemental cycle from Modern Horizons 2. This is a 3/2 elemental invocation with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has Menace and the ability where, when it enters, you look at target opponent's hand. You choose a non-land card from it and they discard that card. Finally, it has Evoke, exile a black card from your hand. This means you can cast it from your hand for this Evoke cost, but you sacrifice it when it enters if you do. On its own, Grief is just a new version of Unmask that's not actively horrible if you cast it for 4 mana. However, because a Grief is a creature, there are plenty of ways to get around the Evoke trigger entirely. Cards like Ephemerate and Not Dead After All allow you to either flicker Grief or make it so that, whenever it dies this turn, it comes right back to the field. This will not only let you keep the 3/2 with Menace, it will also trigger the hand rip effect a second time, letting you get the 2 best cards out of your opponent's hand on turn 1. This was often lights out in a lot of games. With a 3/2 body on board and your 2 best cards gone, mounting anything resembling a proper game plan was all but impossible. There wasn't even that much counterplay, as this would be happening on turn 1 often before you even got to take a single turn. All of these cards are more than playable even if you didn't draw the entire combo, which led to the creation of a deck called Rakdos Scam. We talked about this deck in the last video we did like this when Fury, Grief's brother, was banned from the format. At the time, Wizards thought that hitting Fury would be enough to stop Scam from being the best deck in the format. However, this proved to be not enough. Grief has been giving modern players grief the entire time since that ban list, and after enough time passed, it was still one of the best decks in the format. Wizards decided it needed to be banned. Grief is also the only card to be banned from the Legacy format in this list. The game plan is largely the same as in Modern, except instead of using Ephemerate and the like, players are cheating Grief back into play with reanimation spells. These cards are much better than their equivalents in Modern, as they can snag any creature card in the graveyard, not just affecting creatures in play. This can let you do things like get back Troll of Khazad-dûm that you cycled on turn 1, or get a huge threat like Archon of Cruelty back that you dumped into the graveyard. This made Grief have a much lower deck building cost in the format, as you could just play it with very powerful cards as opposed to cards that were mostly just medium. This led to a lot of games decided by a turn 1 Grief play, just like in Modern. Grief's hold on the metagame has been growing over time, and with Reanimator decks growing in power with more recent additions, it's slowly proven to be too powerful in the format, so Grief was banned from Legacy as well. Before we go into Vintage, the last format where changes have been made, we need to talk about the Ring in the Room. The One Ring has been a very controversial card as of late, seeing play in either the main board or sideboard of basically every deck in Modern that has any sort of long game. It's even more controversial than the community thanks to being unreasonably expensive and there being issues with being able to reprint the card in the future to meet demand. The article mentions this in the Modern section and says that Wizards wants to wait to take action on the card, which they say fairly frequently whenever they do a ban announcement. Most of the time, Wizards is unlikely to ban more than 2 to 3 cards at once, unless it's a real emergency. The One Ring probably will get hit eventually, as it keeps being a problematic card in the format, but Wizards won't act on that until it's the biggest problem in the format. On to the last format we'll be covering in this video, we have Vintage, where 2 cards have been restricted to 1 copy. The first card to get restricted in the format is Urza Saga. This is a Saga enchantment land with 3 chapters. On Chapter 1, it gains the ability to tap for colorless mana. On Chapter 2, it gains the ability to let you pay 2 and tap it to create a 0/0 artifact creature with the ability where it gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Finally, on Chapter 3, it tutors out an artifact with a mana cost of 0 or 1 exactly from your deck and puts it onto the field. Now, Saga is a very powerful card for a number of reasons. Making 2 tokens off the land is extremely powerful, as they can get quite big with just a few artifacts in play. You're going to have a lot of artifacts in play because this is Vintage we're talking about, a format defined by the Moxen and Black Lotus. These are 0 mana artifacts that can be tapped for 1 mana of a specific color that you can tap and sacrifice for 3 mana of any one color, respectively, which is incredibly broken. All of these cards cost 0 as well, so Urza's Saga can tutor them out of your deck if you don't open your Lotus. Now, with all of this broken mana acceleration around, you may assume that the best deck in the format would be a combo deck, but this usually hasn't worked out exactly how you might think. The wealth of cards like Force of Will in the game means that all-in combo decks usually aren't that great. Many decks play combos that can win in the game, but their game plans are usually far more flexible and versatile than combo decks in formats like Modern or Pioneer. The card was being combined with Loris of the Dream Den, a powerful companion which can recast your broken artifacts. This would let them play disruptive spells early and then take over the late game until they could put together a Time Vault combo. Urza's Saga gave the deck a ton of consistency, allowing it to both make huge threats if they successfully slow down their opponent in the early turns of the game, or tutoring out Lotus or Manifold Key, which would usually let you do your Time Vault combo on that turn. Having 4 Sagas just made the deck too consistent, so Wizards decided to restrict the card to 1 copy to make finding your broken artifacts harder, as well as led to less games where Urza's Saga tokens won the game in combat. The second card restricted to 1 in the format is Vexing Bauble. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. It is the ability where, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, you counter that spell. You can also pay 1, tap, and sacrifice the bauble to draw a card. Remember all those broken 0 mana artifacts I mentioned earlier? Vexing Bauble was a way of stopping your opponent from using any of them without messing up your plays at all. You could cast all the 0 mana spells in your hand, then cast the bauble to stop your opponent from doing the same. Then, if you ever needed to cast a 0 mana spell, you could just sacrifice it to draw a card and be totally fine. Now, you may say, isn't it good that Bauble forces players to not rely on all these broken cards? And the answer is no, because it doesn't actually do that. Because Bauble is completely one-sided. Players could just play in a deck with all the other broken restricted mana acceleration. They never actually had to make that choice. This is not like cards such as Trinisphere or Chalice of the Void that can shut down these decks. These cards have strict deck building requirements that keep them out of every single Vintage deck. Not to mention that they are also restricted because they're still really powerful, even if Shops is the main place they see play. Bauble being able to sacrifice itself to draw a card makes it more like a one-sided I win button and less like a targeted stacks piece that different strategies can use to fight back against the most broken cards of the format. The fact that it also turns off all of your opponent's Force of Wills and Dazes during your combo turn just makes it even more toxic in the format. It basically is a no drawback version of cards that are currently restricted to 1 in Vintage already. In order to make Vexing Bauble less of an issue in the format, Wizards decided to restrict it.